Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the hidden realities of global nuclear power. And we aren't just going to look at your standard, traditional power plants. No, we're going to zoom all the way into the atomic level, pull back to look at the massive geopolitical chessboard of world superpowers, and then finally zoom out to a planetary scale to reveal a pretty shocking environmental twist. So get ready, because the way you think about nuclear energy, it's absolutely about to change.
To start us off, I want you to consider the number 90 to 100. When most of us think of nuclear power, we picture those massive, static, concrete domes just sitting quietly in the countryside, right? But right now, literally at this very moment, there are between 90 and 100 mini-nuclear reactors actively moving around the globe on the open ocean.
Okay, let's dive into this. The United States Navy currently operates the largest nuclear-powered fleet in the entire world, boasting roughly 79 to 81 active ships. We're talking 11 aircraft carriers, each packed with dual reactors, and about 68 to 70 submarines, covering everything from fast attack vessels to those massive Ohio-class strategic ballistic missile subs. These floating reactors act as the ultimate global deterrent. Why? Because they allow U.S. fleets to operate continuously for years on end without ever needing to pull into a port for fuel. It's an incredible piece of engineering.
Section 1. Anatomy of nuclear power. The micro level.
But before we can fully grasp the global chess match involving these reactors, we need to transition away from the moving fleet and zoom in on the actual science. We need to understand exactly what's happening at the micro level, right inside the core of a reactor. Basically, every nuclear reactor relies on a highly delicate balance of three core ingredients. First up, you have the fuel. Most commonly, this is uranium enriched to about 3 to 5% for civilian power. Second, you have the coolant, often regular, light water, heavy water, or even liquid metals like sodium. And its job is to carry away the massive heat generated by atomic fission. And third, you've got control materials, usually rods made of elements like boron or cadmium. When you drop these rods into the core, they act like a sponge, absorbing excess neutrons to immediately slow down or stop the chain reaction. This incredibly precise balance is exactly what keeps a plant running safely.
But here is where the science creates a massive, almost unsolvable international headache. The technology used to enrich uranium is fundamentally what we call dual use. The boundary between making a 3% enriched fuel pellet for a civilian power plant and a 90% enriched core for a nuclear weapon, it isn't some totally different science. It is essentially just a matter of time and the number of spins in a centrifuge. And this scientific reality makes nuclear power a highly sensitive global issue.
Section 2. The Global Nuclear Rulebook. Policing the atom.
Because of that tricky dual-use nature, we've got to shift our narrative from science to international law. How on earth does the world prevent the spread of nuclear weapons while still allowing countries to generate civilian power? Well, enter the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. Operating under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the IAEA essentially acts as the globe's ultimate independent auditor. For nations that sign on, the rules are incredibly strict. We are talking about material accountability for literally every single gram of uranium. Facilities are locked down with specialized seals and 24/7 automated camera surveillance streaming right back to Vienna. And through something called the Additional Protocol, inspectors are granted complimentary access, meaning they can show up totally unannounced within hours to take environmental samples. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is just how fragile that global auditing system actually is in practice. You see, the IAEA is not a global police force. They can't just go kicking down doors. Their power relies entirely on voluntary cooperation. As this table lays out, countries like India, Pakistan, and Israel never even signed the treaty, which severely limits or entirely blocks IAEA access. North Korea famously withdrew back in 2003 and expelled all the inspectors. And Iran, while a member, has restricted access, completely eliminating those crucial unannounced checks. It's this incredibly complex web of diplomacy that leaves the global auditor essentially blindfolded when sovereign nations simply refuse to play along. So you might be wondering, why can't the United States just step in and enforce the rules? Well, despite its immense economic and military power, the U.S. faces severe structural and legal limits. Under international law, the U.S. is bound by UN principles of national sovereignty, meaning they can't just dictate policy to non-compliant sovereign nations. Any binding international enforcement requires the UN Security Council, and that's where geopolitical rivals like China and Russia hold absolute veto power. Combine that with the sheer logistical difficulty of proving that dual-use goods, like, say, carbon fiber, are destined for weapons rather than civilian industry, and you start to see why Washington is so often legally gridlocked on this.
Section 3. America's Advanced Reactor Push, Reclaiming Domestic Leadership.
Recognizing these massive international limitations, the United States has decided to pivot. They're aggressively trying to reclaim domestic leadership in nuclear innovation, starting by attacking their own internal regulatory hurdles. To understand this shift, we just need to look at Executive Order 14301, signed by President Donald J. Trump on May 23, 2025. This order explicitly declares a national energy emergency. The document makes the case that America's proud history of nuclear innovation has essentially succumbed to overregulated complacency. It's arguing that bureaucratic red tape has paralyzed the industry for decades, which in turn allowed foreign nations to take the lead.
The directives in this executive order are, frankly, incredibly aggressive. It mandates the elimination or expedition of complex environmental reviews by June 30, 2025. It also pushes the Department of Energy to get 3 pilot test reactors safely operational outside of traditional national labs by July 4, 2026. That is a ridiculously tight 2-year timeline. The strategic focus here leans heavily on microreactors, Generation 4 technology, and small modular reactors, or SMRs. The goal? To power everything from defense industries to massive commercial data centers.
Section 4. China's Nuclear Silk Road, Expanding Global Influence.
But while the U.S. is racing to deregulate and build at home, we're witnessing a totally opposing strategy unfolding across the globe. China is taking a very different approach here. Instead of focusing solely on massive, expensive traditional plants, they are mass-producing and exporting those small modular reactors we just talked about, like their Linglong 1 model. They're sending these directly to developing nations across Africa, South Asia, and Central Asia through their Belt and Road Initiative. These emerging markets desperately need clean energy, but they lack the billions of dollars and massive grid infrastructure required for a conventional power plant. China's SMRs offer a cheaper, faster, plug-and-play solution that fits the bill perfectly.
So the crucial point is what happens after the sale. Industry observers actually call this strategy a 60 to 80-year technology trap. When a developing nation buys a Chinese reactor, they aren't just buying a piece of hardware like you'd buy a car. No, they become entirely dependent on Beijing for specialized enriched fuel, for maintenance, for operational training, and even for nuclear waste disposal. It literally ties the purchasing nation to China's technological and security orbit for nearly a century.
Comparing these two approaches side by side really clarifies the global race we're looking at. On one hand, you have the U.S. strategy. It's an internal technological sprint, bypassing domestic bureaucracy to fast-track next-generation testing via private and public sector cooperation. On the other hand, you have the Chinese strategy, an outward geoeconomic expansion, mass-producing accessible technology to create long-term international dependencies. It is, without a doubt, a defining clash of strategies for the 21st century.
Section 5. The Climate Change Threat. The Ultimate Regulator.
But just when you think this is purely a story about human geopolitics and technological rivalry, we have to zoom out one final time to the macro level. And this brilliantly illustrates a core vulnerability we almost always overlook. For all of our advanced physics and fancy diplomatic treaties, nuclear facilities are fundamentally entirely dependent on their surrounding natural environments. Human engineering, no matter how advanced it gets, always operates at the absolute mercy of Mother Nature. Think about it. Historically, when the industry thought about natural threats, they focused on localized geological events. The benchmark for this, of course, was the tragic 2011 Fukushima Daiichi disaster in Japan. A massive 9.0 earthquake triggered a tsunami that completely overwhelmed the seawalls, destroyed the backup diesel generators, and left the plant without power to pump cooling water, which ultimately led to a core meltdown. So for years, earthquakes and tsunamis were considered the ultimate test of nuclear safety.
Actually, scratch that. Because today, the whole paradigm has shifted. A new, much more pervasive threat has emerged: climate change. We are now seeing extreme heat waves and severe droughts directly suffocating modern nuclear output all over the globe. It's no longer just about a localized earthquake. It's a systemic environmental shift that, quite frankly, these reactors simply weren't designed for.
To put that into perspective, just think about the magnitude of 7 gigawatts. That is the massive amount of energy capacity that France, which is one of the most nuclear-reliant countries in the entire world, by the way, was forced to cut from its grid during the intense summer heat waves of 2025. That's enough energy to power an entire small nation, lost simply because they lacked cool enough water to safely run their systems.
Let's look at a really specific, recent example of this in action. In June 2026, over at France's Goffec plant, extreme heat pushed ambient temperatures past 44 degrees Celsius. The plant relies on the nearby Garonne River for its cooling process. However, strict environmental regulations dictate that the water returned to the river absolutely cannot exceed 28 degrees Celsius. Why? To prevent boiling the local aquatic ecosystem alive. Because the river was already too hot from the heat wave, the reactor was forced into a complete shutdown. Advanced nuclear technology was totally paralyzed simply because environmental protection laws clashed with climate extremes.
Now take that exact vulnerability and apply it to the geopolitical chessboard we were just talking about. This threatens everyone. If a severe climate event, like a massive drought or an unprecedented heat wave, hits a newly exported Chinese SMR in a developing nation that lacks emergency infrastructure, the resulting crisis could instantly derail Beijing's entire Belt and Road nuclear strategy. And similarly, as the U.S. rushes to deploy advanced reactors domestically, it has to face the harsh reality that its own rivers and coastlines are fundamentally changing.
So, we've journeyed from the microscopic fission of uranium through the halls of the UN and the aggressive strategies of Washington and Beijing, all the way to the warming rivers of Europe. The technology is absolutely incredible, but the vulnerabilities are profound. It leaves us with one unavoidable question to ponder today. In the race for global nuclear supremacy, will geopolitics or nature have the final say? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this gives you a completely new lens to view the news through, and I definitely encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating topic on your own. See you next time.